Welcome to one of the strangest houses ever sealed by silence. Chicago, 1978. A winter wrapped in gray skies and breath that turned to mist. Snow gathered on rooftops, television screens flickered in living rooms, and the suburbs, neat, proud, and ordinary, slept under the illusion of safety. Behind one of those houses, at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, a man smiled as he shoveled his driveway, waving at his neighbors like every other morning. His name was John Wayne Gacy, the man who wore a clown's face. A familiar sight at children's hospitals, charity events, community parades, a local hero in makeup, red nose, painted grin. He called himself Pogo the Clown. He made balloon animals, cracked jokes, sang songs about laughter and joy. But no one knew that just beneath that smile, the earth itself was holding its breath. Neighbors had begun to whisper about the smell. Some said it was a dead rat. Others thought the sewer line had cracked. But when the wind changed, the odor lingered. Thick, sweet, impossible to name. It rose from the crawl space, seeping through the vents, through the cracks in the floorboards, until even the house itself seemed to exhale secrets. One December evening, a mother called the police. Her son, a teenage boy, hadn't returned from a job interview. The last person to see him alive was the man with the painted smile. A search began, quiet, methodical, as snow fell heavier over Chicago. Officers knocked on doors, followed leads, checked phone records, and every road somehow led back to the same suburban house. When detectives finally stepped into 8213 West Somerdale, they saw what everyone else saw. The clean carpets, the polished photos, the trophies on the shelves. Gacy stood there, calm, polite, even joking. He offered them coffee. He said, "You won't find anything here." But one officer paused. His eyes drifted toward a faint dark patch on the basement floor, the kind that comes from moisture or something else. The air grew colder. There was a moment, a silence so sharp it seemed to cut through the hum of the furnace, the kind of silence that tells you the truth is just underfoot. Soon the police would discover what lay beneath the concrete, but not yet. For now, the man in the clown's face still smiled, still walked freely, still told his friends he'd been framed. They say evil hides in shadows, but sometimes it hides in plain sight, wearing bright colors and laughter, and the people who saw him never realized that they were staring into the eyes of something far older, far darker than madness. Because there's something about a smile, it disarms us. It tells us everything is fine. It tells us to look away. And he knew that. He knew exactly how to make the world look away. When the truth finally came out, the newspapers struggled for words. Some called it the suburban horror. Others simply said, the clown. But those who had met him, who'd shaken his hand, shared a drink, laughed at his jokes, said one thing over and over again. He didn't seem like the kind of man who could do this. That's the illusion, isn't it? The way monsters hide, not in the dark, but in the light. Behind a friendly voice, a painted grin, a handshake, a promise. Behind normality itself. So tonight, we return to that quiet house, where laughter once echoed and silence answered back. We return to the basement that no one dared to open, the house no one dared to dig up, and we ask ourselves, how could a man convince the world that his sins were never his own? How could he, even after everything, still believe he was innocent? Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what's the one sound that makes you uneasy when you're alone at home, because sometimes the sound you fear isn't outside your door, it's under your floor. Chicago winter of 1978. A city between two worlds, progress and decay. Factories closing, unemployment rising, families trying to keep Christmas lights shining in the snow. The war in Vietnam was over, but the country hadn't really healed. The suburbs had become a refuge, a place where people believed the worst things happened somewhere else. Norwood Park was one of those places, a neighborhood built on the promise of safety. Maple trees lining the streets, kids riding bicycles after school, neighbors waving at each other over white fences. It was the kind of American dream people saw in commercials, tidy, polite, predictable. And right in the middle of it stood a small, single-story house, beige siding, neat garden, American flag fluttering on the porch. 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, the home of John Wayne Gacy. To most, he was a success story, a man who'd built himself up from nothing. A small-time contractor who employed local boys, sponsored charity events, and hosted summer barbecues. He laughed easily, spoke loudly, and never missed a handshake. He was a joiner, as people used to say, member of the JCs, a civic volunteer, a man who showed up. Even his mugshot later would look like someone's cheerful uncle caught at a bad moment. But beneath the photographs and the parades there were cracks. Those who knew him closely spoke of his moods, the sudden flashes of anger, the late nights when his car would vanish for hours. Some of his workers whispered about the smell under the house. Others joked about it because that's what people do when something feels wrong but too strange to face. Still, no one really wanted to believe the rumors. No one wanted to think that evil could look like this. America in the late 70s was obsessed with appearances, the image of middle-class respectability, the quiet pride of home ownership. The same decade that built shopping malls and disco clubs also bred isolation, long stretches of darkness between the streetlights. Behind every front door, secrets slept, and no one asked questions they didn't want answered. It was a time when you trusted the smiling man who offered to help, especially if he wore a badge, a uniform, or a clown's face. Gacy knew that. He understood people's hunger for comfort, their desperate need to believe in the good neighbor, the community man, the performer who brought joy. He weaponized normalcy. Every smile, every party, every parade appearance was camouflage. When he put on the white makeup and the red grin of Pogo the Clown, he became untouchable, a symbol of laughter, innocence, childhood. And who would ever suspect the clown? Somewhere in the city, teenagers disappeared. A hitchhiker, a store clerk, a part-time worker. Names appeared briefly in the Chicago Tribune, then vanished under headlines about politics and snowstorms. Families filed reports, waited by phones that never rang. And the man at 8213 kept hosting parties, drinking with friends, and performing magic tricks for children. People later said there was something about his basement, a faint earthy smell that grew stronger when the furnace ran. He always had an explanation, a leaky pipe, damp soil, an old sewer problem. It sounded reasonable. Everything about him sounded reasonable. That was his power. In the winter of '78, detectives were stretched thin. The city was dealing with runaway cases, burglaries, cold weather deaths. No one imagined that the neat little house with Christmas lights still glowing through the snow was about to become a national headline. But it would soon. The truth was already there under the floor, waiting for someone to listen. On the surface, life went on, coffee brewing in kitchens, cars scraping ice off windshields, laughter echoing in schoolyards. And in that normal rhythm, Gacy thrived, unseen, unchallenged, a man perfectly fitted to his time. He lived in the shadow of an American belief that evil always wears a warning sign. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it looks right at you and smiles. He once told a friend, "Clowns can get away with anything, people just laugh." It sounded like a joke back then. Now it feels like a confession whispered through paint and powder. The 1970s were ending. America was tired, cynical, and lonely, looking for distraction, for comfort, for laughter. And in that hunger for innocence, darkness found its way back in. Because behind the laughter, behind the parades and painted faces, a house on West Somerdale was quietly filling with silence, and no one dared to ask, why? December 11th, 1978. The file begins with a name, Robert Piest, age 15, last seen at a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. He told his mother he was stepping outside to talk to a contractor about a possible job. He never came back. The police report notes it plainly. Subject left premises at approximately 9:00 p.m. did not return. Believed to be in company of John Wayne Gacy, age 36, local contractor. At first, no one thought much of it. Teenagers went missing all the time in the late 70s. Some ran away, some vanished into the city, some simply weren't found. But there was something about this case, the detail that a responsible, well-known man was the last to see him, that didn't sit right with Detective Joseph Kozenchak of the Des Plaines Police Department. When officers went to speak with Gacy, they found him oddly confident, almost amused. He admitted he'd spoken to the boy, but denied knowing where he'd gone. He smiled, often cracked jokes, invited them to look around. The detectives noted that he seemed friendly, composed, cooperative. Still, there was that smell. The first search warrant allowed them only to look for evidence related to the missing boy, employment records, photographs, contracts. They found none. But one officer, Robert Schultz, couldn't shake the odor from his memory. He later described it as a combination of dampness, decay, and something sweet. The kind of smell that doesn't come from rot, but from what rot leaves behind. A few days later, under pressure, Gacy's calm began to slip. He shadowed detectives around town, showing up unexpectedly at restaurants, stations, parking lots. He bought them coffee, laughed about being the most watched man in Chicago. Detective Kozenchak wrote in his log, "Suspect appears to be testing limits, exhibits no fear of law enforcement, behavior erratic." By December 20th, surveillance teams reported Gacy driving at night, long hours, aimless routes. He drank heavily. He confessed small sins, then took them back. He told one officer he'd done bad things, then smiled and said he was joking. That same night, investigators obtained a second warrant. This one allowed them to dig. At 8:00 p.m., the search began. Police entered the house under a dim porch light, Christmas decorations still hanging. The furnace rattled, the air thick, stale metallic. One officer knelt near the crawl space entrance, a square of plywood beneath the hallway. When they lifted it, a wave of odor struck them like heat. It was over then. The illusion was broken. Within hours, evidence technicians began excavating. The first remains were found wrapped in plastic, partly skeletal, partly preserved by cold soil. Each new discovery came with silence. By dawn, they'd marked the spot of 2 bodies. Within days, they'd uncover 29. The official report would later read, "The residence at 8213 W Summerdale Avenue contained multiple human remains buried in shallow trenches beneath the foundation. Each grave was numbered, cause of death undetermined in most cases." Neighbors crowded the street, television crews, police cars, reporters scribbling notes as steam rose from the frozen ground. The smell carried on the wind for blocks. People watched in disbelief as one stretcher after another left the house that had once hosted birthday parties. When Gacy was finally arrested, he maintained his composure. He told detectives he had nothing to hide. But after 48 hours of questioning, the mask began to crack. In a quiet interview room, his voice low, he said something that chilled everyone present. "Clowns can get away with murder because people don't believe in them." Then he laughed. The written transcript of his confession reads like a descent, a shifting line between guilt and performance. He admitted helping dispose of bodies but blamed other people. He spoke of multiple personalities. He said, "There's a part of me you don't understand, a part that isn't me." To psychiatrists, he described himself as a businessman with a hobby of entertaining. He spoke of childhood beatings, strict parents, failed marriages. He turned his story into theater. Even as he described the crawl space, he called it a place for rest. When asked why he buried them, he said, "Because they were mine." The court records from 1980 list the official count: 33 young men ages 14 to 21, 29 buried beneath the house, 4 dumped into the Des Plaines River. Each identified through dental records, fingerprints, scraps of clothing. Forensic teams worked for months cataloging every bone, every trace. One photograph shows a single shoe on the dirt floor untouched by time. Another, a row of evidence bags lined against a wall numbered 1 through 33. The public called him the Killer Clown. Newspapers printed his painted face beside the words, "Smiles of Death." But the man himself never used the word guilty. He told a reporter years later, "I'm just the guy who's paying for someone else's sins." Psychologists called it narcissistic detachment, the refusal to accept moral responsibility even in the face of overwhelming evidence. But to those who'd stood in that basement, to the families who waited months for identification, it wasn't psychology, it was evil, pure and patient. On March 13, 1980, the verdict came guilty on all counts. But the story didn't end there. Even in prison, Gacy painted dozens of canvases of clown skulls and smiling faces. He signed each one Pogo. He sent them to collectors, to strangers, to anyone who'd listen. Each painting another reminder that he still believed the performance wasn't over. And maybe in his mind it never was. Because even after all the evidence, all the graves, all the witnesses, he said it again, calm, unshaken, as though reciting a joke he'd told too many times. "I'm not the monster, I'm just misunderstood." The file ends there, but the echo doesn't. After the police left, the street stayed quiet. Neighbors kept their curtains drawn even in daylight. Children stopped riding bikes past 8213 West Summerdale. The house sat there hollow, a shell of plaster, in silence, as if it had exhaled something it could never take back. For months, no one touched it. Real estate agents refused to list it. Contractors refused to enter. One man who came to remove debris told a reporter later, "It felt like the ground didn't want to be disturbed. Every shovel of dirt made the air thicker." Some said that on certain nights when fog rolled low over the lawns, they could still smell something faint. Metallic, sickly sweet, like the echo of decay baked into the soil. Others swore they heard knocking sounds under the foundation, even though the house was already gone. Because yes, in 1979, the city demolished it. Bulldozers tore it down in less than an hour. A whole nightmare flattened into dust. But people who watched said something strange, that when the last wall fell, there was a sound, like a sigh escaping the ground itself. Reporters wrote about it, a single line buried in a column. Witnesses described a sudden shift of wind as the house collapsed. No one mentioned that several bystanders fainted. After the demolition, the lot remained empty. Grass grew over the scars. In winter, snow covered everything soft, forgiving white. But no one built there again. No family ever applied for a permit. To this day, the address 8213 West Summerdale no longer exists on paper. It was wiped clean, as if erasing a word could erase the memory. Yet the legend stayed. Teenagers dared each other to stand at the curb at midnight. Some claimed to see shapes moving in the mist, the outline of a man in grease paint standing where the front door used to be. Others heard the sound of a distant laugh, faint as static on an old radio. One story tells of a mail carrier who refused to deliver to that block for years. He said every time he passed, his bag would feel heavier, as if something unseen was tugging at it. In the years that followed, people began buying his paintings, the ones he made in prison. Bright, childlike, grotesque. Pogo the clown with his red smile. The American flag painted behind him distorted. Each brushstroke layered like a memory he refused to bury. Collectors hung them in private rooms, some out of fascination, others out of disbelief. But then came the rumors. Owners reported nightmares, long corridors, echoing laughter, wet footprints on wooden floors. One painting was said to make clocks stop, another to change its colors in candlelight. A journalist who'd written about the case hung one in his office. 3 weeks later, he threw it away after hearing tapping sounds from the wall behind it. He said the tapping followed him home. It became a kind of modern American curse, a relic of horror disguised as art. Pogo's paintings, they called them. Each canvas a doorway, or perhaps a mirror. And just like the house, people couldn't decide what they feared more, the darkness inside it or the reflection it offered of themselves. In folklore, clowns had always walked the edge between joy and dread. In medieval fairs, they wore masks to mock death. In old superstition, the painted smile was a way to trick evil spirits to show laughter so they wouldn't see fear. But what happens when the mask becomes the evil itself? When the laughter is not protection, but the weapon? Some believe Gacy wasn't the start of the fear, only its symbol, because after him, clowns changed. Children stopped trusting them. Birthday parties grew quieter. Television shows blurred the line between comedy and nightmare. Every painted grin carried his ghost, and every parent somewhere deep down began to ask the question that haunted the suburbs. What if the monsters we fear don't live in the woods, but next door? In the decades since urban legends spread, people said they'd seen white balloons appear on fences near Des Plaines, tied with string, drifting in windless nights. They said the balloons always popped by dawn, no one ever heard the sound. One radio host swore that a caller from Illinois once described a dream of a clown digging in his backyard, whispering, "There's still room." The call ended with static. No one ever traced it. Even today, the lot where 8213 once stood looks ordinary. A patch of grass, a stretch of concrete, a silence too steady. Locals pass it without slowing down. But at night, when the wind slides off Lake Michigan and the streetlights flicker, there's a feeling, as if something beneath the soil still remembers being found. And maybe it does, because folklore isn't just about ghosts. It's about what people can't forget, the stories they tell to give shape to fear. And in Chicago, 1978 never really ended. It lingers in the smell of damp earth after rain, in the laughter that shouldn't be there, in the way people still look twice at a painted smile. There's something about masks, something ancient, older than makeup, older than theater. They were meant to protect us, to frighten the darkness, to play tricks on spirits. But somewhere along the line, the masks stopped keeping evil out and began keeping it in. Gacy wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. He was just the perfect reflection of a time when America stopped believing that monsters looked different from us. Because once you saw his face, the smiling neighbor, the community volunteer, the clown, you realized that the darkness could wear a suit, could host a party, could live behind your own wall. In Wichita, Kansas, a man called himself BTK. He tied, he controlled, he killed, but also went to church on Sundays. In Milwaukee, a quiet tenant named Jeffrey Dahmer kept a refrigerator no one dared open. In Plainfield, Wisconsin, decades earlier, Ed Gein built trophies out of what he could not let go of. Each one a new echo of the same motif: ordinary faces, extraordinary horror. They didn't hunt in forests, they built theirs. 4 walls, a front porch, a garden, the perfect camouflage for the American dream. Because horror here wasn't an intruder, it was domestic. It lived among us, mowing lawns, paying bills, waving to the mailman. That was the true invention of the 20th century, not the car, not the computer, but the ordinary mask of evil. The 1970s were the decade that killed innocence. Vietnam was over, but the footage still played in people's heads. Watergate had shown how lies could wear official smiles. And Gacy? He showed how murder could wear face paint. Each scandal, each crime, each revelation tore another hole in America's reflection, until the country began to see itself not as a hero, but as something haunted. The clown became the emblem of that transformation, once a symbol of joy, now a vessel of fear. Hollywood followed Poltergeist, It, Joker, American Horror Story, all of them chasing the ghost of Pogo, the laugh that hides the scream. But beneath the fiction, there was still the truth of that house on Summerdale Avenue, the basement, the smell, the silence. And the question that lingers through every decade since: how many masks do we still wear pretending the world is fine? Because evil the kind Gacy embodied isn't supernatural. It's social. It's polite. It shakes hands, volunteers jokes, and says, "Have a nice day." It's the reflection in the mirror that you don't want to admit is yours. That's what makes his story endure, not the horror of what he did, but the recognition of how close he was to what we call normal. Every generation rediscovers the same fear in new clothes. In the 1950s, it was the stranger at the door. In the 1970s, it was the man next door. In the 2020s, it's the smiling profile picture, the face filtered, brightened, safe. But the pattern never changes. We keep building masks, hoping the darkness stays behind them. And every few decades, one of them cracks. In that way, Gacy isn't a story about one man. He's a warning about everyone else. The kind of darkness that doesn't shout, it imitates. It studies us. It learns our smiles, our jokes, our voices, until we can no longer tell the difference between performance and confession. When psychologists studied his interviews, they noted the calm, the rhythm of someone telling a story he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. They called it detachment personality disorder, narcissistic delusion. But maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe some people become so good at pretending that even they forget what the mask was meant to hide. A line from his diary still circulates among true crime forums, written in pencil uneven. "If I had been loved, I might have been normal. No one knows if it's real or just another performance, but it doesn't matter. Because that's what makes the myth survive, not the facts, but the fractures, the spaces where truth and lie breathe together." The bridge between Gacy and every other mask in history isn't the crimes, it's the denial, the calm insistence, "I'm not the monster." It's the same sentence whispered in interrogation rooms across decades, in courtrooms, in quiet suburban kitchens where someone says, "He seemed so nice." That sentence is the real American haunting. And maybe that's why decades later we still can't let him go. Because when we look at his painted grin, we're not just seeing Gacy. We're seeing the reflection of every time we ignored the smell, every time we looked away, every time we told ourselves the mask was real. So the story travels from Chicago 1978 to everywhere people still pretend. It lingers in the corners of parades, in the laughter of birthday parties, in the echo of a knock under the floor. It whispers through generations, a reminder that the house on Summerdale wasn't built on horror alone. It was built on trust. And trust, once broken, becomes legend. They said the air inside that house never felt right again. Even after the heat was turned off, even after the bodies were gone, something in the walls remembered. December 22, 1978. The dig had gone on for hours. The crawl space was barely 3 feet high. Men lay flat on their stomachs, scraping soil with gloved hands, their breath echoing against the joists. The smell indescribable, sweet, sour, damp. It clung to their hair, their uniforms, their souls. One officer, hardened by years in homicide, crawled out shaking. He lit a cigarette and whispered, "That's not dirt down there. That's history." The cameras arrived at dawn, snow falling through, gray light steam rising from the earth where the ground was torn open. Neighbors watched from their windows holding coffee mugs that had gone cold. A reporter's voice trembled through static. Authorities continued to recover what they describe only as remains. Each discovery blurred the line between the procedural and the surreal. A bone, a ring, a sneaker small enough to belong to a boy barely 16. They logged everything, bagged everything, numbered everything, but some officers stopped writing halfway. Their hands couldn't move. Someone said they heard a laugh echo through the vent, soft like a trick of wind. Another swore they saw a shadow move against the wall when no one was there. It didn't matter whether it was real. In a house like that, belief had no choice but to exist. When Gacy was brought back to the scene, handcuffed, face pale under fluorescent lights, he looked down at the pit and said nothing. Just one small smile, tired, almost human. Detectives waited for remorse. It never came. He looked at the dirt, the tarps, the officers gagging behind masks and said, "You'll find them all eventually. I just forgot where." That line made the front page the next morning. The Sun-Times printed it in bold. The Tribune called him the most polite killer in America. But those who were there said something different. They said he didn't look like a monster at all. He looked bored. One detective remembered the flicker of confusion in Gacy's eyes, like he was watching someone else's story unfold. When asked why he did it, he said, "I never did. They were already dead inside when I met them." A sentence that made no sense, and yet explained everything. He believed it. He needed to believe it, that the things he did were not his fault, that something else had moved his hands, something broken long before he was born. To the end, he repeated the same phrase, "I'm not guilty." Morning over Chicago. Gray light seeping through the skyline, washing over rooftops and empty streets. The city wakes, the same city that once turned its face away from a man who smiled too easily. Time, they say, buries everything. But time doesn't dig. It only covers. The lot on West Summerdale is quiet now. Grass sways where the walls once stood. There's no house, no fence, no sign, just a patch of earth pretending to forget. A few blocks away, life goes on. Buses groan, dogs bark, laughter spills from a cafe. No one looks back. They never do. But memory is a strange architect. It rebuilds what we destroy. Every retelling lays another brick. Every photograph, every documentary, every whispered story around a campfire brings the house back room by room until it stands again invisible, but there. And inside it, the echo of a voice still asking the same question. Do you believe in clowns? They say evil dies when it's understood, but this kind never was. It's the kind that survives in repetition, in laughter that sounds too rehearsed, in kindness that feels just a little too perfect. It hides behind charm, behind apology, behind the insistence of innocence. And maybe that's why John Wayne Gacy still haunts us, because he believed his own mask. The court records close with the words, "Sentence carried out." Yet somehow, his smile outlived him. It slipped into nightmares, into movies, into the collective pulse of a country that can't stop looking into its own reflection. Every time another crime shocks the world, every time another neighbor says, "He seemed like a good man," the ghost of Pogo laughs again quietly from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards of the American mind. Perhaps that's the real punishment, not the cell, not the execution, but the immortality of horror. To become the thing people fear long after they stop remembering your name. The clown without an audience. The laughter without sound. The man who will never stop smiling because he doesn't know how. And maybe that's the part that unsettles us most. That behind every painted grin, there might be a reflection of something too human. A loneliness too deep. A craving to be seen, even if it means becoming the monster everyone remembers. There's an old superstition that when you bury something wicked, you must plant something living on top to keep it asleep. On West Summerdale Avenue, grass grows thick and wild. No one cuts it too short. No one digs too deep. It's as if the soil itself remembers what it once held and what it refuses to release. So if you ever find yourself walking there on a cold evening when the air smells of wet earth and distant snow, stop for a moment. Listen, you might hear nothing, or you might hear a faint scraping underfoot, a whisper that sounds like breath or laughter or both. And when you do, don't run. Just remember, you're not hearing the past. You're hearing what happens when the mask refuses to die. Because in the end, the house is gone, but the face remains. The painted smile, the echo that never fades. And somewhere between the silence of the ground and the noise of our own denial, John Wayne Gacy is still insisting calmly, eternally, "I was never guilty." Pause. Fade to black. Wind. A single red balloon drifting upward, disappearing into a gray Chicago sky. Before you go, tell me in the comments, have you ever trusted someone who smiled too easily? Because sometimes the scariest faces are the ones that make us feel safe.